There are moments in life that hit you like an unexpected jolt on a sharp turn, the kind where the whole load shifts, and for a second you think, this is it. But the jolt I'm talking about wasn't about the rig, not about the machine. It was inside, in my chest, in my head, in a place I didn't even know could be shaken so hard. It's been a while now, but it feels like it was just last night, every detail still burning in my memory like a live coal. I'm not entirely sure why I'm even putting this down. Maybe to get it out, maybe to see if anyone else has gone through something similar, or maybe just to try and make some sense of what really happened that one night. The night that turned my world upside down and made me question every mile I'd ever driven, every choice I'd ever made, every feeling I thought I had locked away safe and sound deep inside me. That was the night I met her, out on a desolate stretch of highway, a night that redefined everything I thought I knew about the road, about people, and about myself, Jack Miller. It was another pre-dawn run, one of those where exhaustion has long since become a travel companion, an invisible co-driver riding shotgun. I was pushing my rig down one of those long, lonely highways, a stretch I'd driven 100 times before, yet it always felt a bit treacherous, especially in the dead of night when the darkness seems to swallow you and the asphalt whole. The air was heavy, muggy, you know? The kind where you roll down the truck window and the hot wind just seems to make it worse, clinging to your skin. I was thinking about nothing and everything all at once, that usual mix of worrying about bills, a longing for a time that's gone and won't come back, the kind of loneliness that squeezes the chest of a man who lives more in his cab than in any real home. This was my routine, had been for over 20 years. The road consuming me, and me consuming the road, an exchange I'd come to accept, or at least had gotten used to as the only life possible for a guy like me, a bit calloused, a bit jaded about fate's little twists. I had no idea what a number fate was about to pull on me, the kind that doesn't just twist the plot but tears up the whole script. Then, cutting through the monotony of the headlights on the endless blacktop, I saw something. At first, it was just a shape at the edge of the road, where the tall grass met the gravel shoulder. My eyes are trained to spot anything unusual out there. Deer, debris, another truck pulled over, but this wasn't any of those things. As I got closer, the shape resolved itself into a person, a woman, standing stock still by the side of the road. And man, she stood out. She was dressed all in white, a simple dress, almost like a nightgown, and her feet were bare on the rough ground. In the middle of nowhere, miles from any town or even a gas station, it was a strange, unsettling sight. Her hair was dark, and even from a distance, I could see she was looking right at my approaching rig, not with fear or desperation, but with this calm, an almost unnerving serenity that just didn't fit with the desolation of the place or the dead of night. It was the kind of image that sticks with you, makes the hairs on the back of your neck prickle a bit, not necessarily from fear, but from the sheer oddity of it all. My first instinct, the one drilled into me by years on the road, was trouble. You just don't see that, not out here. Every trucker knows. The stories, the scams, the dangers lurking in the shadows of these lonely stretches. My hand was already easing off the accelerator, my mind racing through all the reasons I shouldn't stop, all the warnings I'd heard and even given myself over the years. Keep going, Jack. That's what the sensible part of me screamed. But then something else kicked in, a feeling I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way she just stood there, so still and alone, or that serene look on her face that seemed to cut through my usual cynicism. It was an impulse, strong and sudden, that made me hit the air brakes, the hiss and groan of the truck echoing in the otherwise silent night as I pulled the heavy rig over onto the shoulder a little ways past her. I remember thinking, what in the Sam Hill am I doing? This isn't me. But there I was, engine idling, reaching over to crank the passenger window down, the stale cab air mixing with that heavy night outside. I leaned across the cab, the springs of the old passenger seat groaning under my weight, even without anyone in it, and pushed the door open a crack. "You all right out there, ma'am?" I called out, my voice sounding rougher than I intended, cutting through the thrum of the diesel engine. She didn't startle, didn't rush. She just walked towards the truck, slow and deliberate, her white dress almost glowing faintly in the dim light from my dashboard and the distant moon. She moved with a kind of grace that seemed out of place for someone found on a dirt shoulder in the middle of the night. When she reached the passenger side, she looked up at me, and that serene expression was still there, her eyes dark and deep, holding mine for a moment before she spoke. Her voice was soft, not a whisper, but quiet and clear. "I could use a ride if you're heading east." That was it. No long story, no panic, just a simple request. I hesitated for a split second longer, every instinct still buzzing, but then I just nodded. "Hop in," I said, trying to sound casual, like this was something I did every other Tuesday. She climbed in, settling into the worn seat, and as she closed the door, a strange sort of quiet fell over the cab, different from the usual solitude. She just said her name was Maria. That was all she offered by way of introduction, and I didn't press for more. I wasn't much for small talk myself, especially with strangers who appeared on lonely highways in the dead of night. I put the rig in gear, the air brakes releasing with their familiar sigh, and eased us back onto the dark ribbon of asphalt. For a while, we just rode in silence, the only sounds the rumble of the engine, the whine of the tires, and the occasional crackle from the CB radio that I hadn't bothered to turn off. I kept glancing over at her, trying to figure her out. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking around nervously like most people would be in her situation. She just sat there, watching the dark world slide by the window, as if riding in a stranger's semi at 3 a.m. was the most natural thing in the world. Then, out of the blue, she turned to me, her voice still soft, and said something that nearly made me swerve. "It's a heavy load you're carrying tonight, Jack, isn't it? And I don't just mean the freight." Her words hung in the stale air of the cab, heavy as a chain. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles showing white. For a long moment, I didn't say anything, just stared out at the white lines whipping past. Under the headlights, each one feeling like another step deeper into whatever strange territory this night was taking me. My first instinct was to shut her down, to give some gruff reply about how every load is heavy, mind her own business. That was the old Jack, the one who kept everyone at arm's length, the one who'd built walls so high around himself he barely remembered what it felt like to let anyone in. But looking at her, sitting there so calm, her eyes holding no judgment, just a kind of deep, quiet understanding, something cracked inside me. Maybe it was the loneliness of the road, years of it, or just the sheer unexpectedness of someone seeing past the calloused surface. "Yeah," I finally breathed out, the word raspy, like it had been dragged over gravel. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Some loads you can't unload at any warehouse." She didn't pry, didn't push. She just nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the passing darkness outside, as if she could see the ghosts of my past flickering in the landscape. "The heaviest ones are the ones we pack ourselves, aren't they?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying more weight than a sermon. "The ones made of unspoken words, of doors we closed too quickly, or maybe never had the courage to open. And just like that, the dam I'd carefully constructed inside me for decades, stone by painful stone, began to groan under the pressure. It started as a trickle, a hesitant admission about the job, the way it grinds a man down, isolates him. I talked about the endless miles that were supposed to mean freedom, but had slowly become a kind of prison, each mile marker a tombstone for a day I wasn't living, a day I was away from, well, from everything that was supposed to matter. I hadn't spoken like this to another soul in years, maybe ever. But with Maria, it felt different, like speaking into a deep well, knowing the words would be held, not judged or thrown back in my face. It started small, you know, I found myself saying, the words feeling foreign on my tongue after being locked away for so long. Just a way to make good money, see a bit of the country. That's what I told myself, that's what I told Susan. The name, her name, felt like a ghost in the cab. Maria didn't flinch, didn't react, just kept that steady, listening silence that was more inviting than any question. Susan. God, she was something else. Full of life, a laugh that could fill a room, and eyes that, honest to God, sparkled when she was happy. We met at a diner just off the interstate, one of those places with a neon sign and coffee that could strip paint. I was just a young buck then, full of piss and vinegar, thought I was king of the world behind the wheel of my first rig. She saw something in me, though, something I guess I'd long since buried or lost by the side of some forgotten highway. We had plans, big plans, a little place of our own, maybe a couple of kids, the whole 9 yards. For a while, it felt like we were really building something, a life. But the road, I continued, my voice dropping a little, the old familiar ache settling in my chest. It's a jealous mistress, they say. Or maybe I was just weak, too damn selfish. The miles started piling up, and so did the excuses. Just one more run, honey, this one pays double. I'll be back before you know it. Promises I made, promises I broke, over and over again. Her birthdays I missed, anniversaries spent on opposite sides of the in-country, those little everyday moments that build a life together. I traded them all for the hum of the highway, for the illusion of freedom that was really just me running. Running from what? I don't know. Responsibility? Intimacy? Myself, maybe. I remember the way her voice would get a little quieter on the phone each time I said I'd be late again. The way that sparkle in her eyes started to dim, replaced by a kind of tired resignation. It wasn't just that I was gone so much. It was that when I was home, I wasn't really there. I brought the road back with me. The silence, the distance, the weariness. I was a ghost at my own table. The silence in the cab stretched for a bit after I spoke of Susan, filled only by the drone of the engine and the hiss of the tires on wet asphalt. A light rain had started to fall, smearing the view outside. I could feel Maria's presence beside me, not judging, just there. It made it easier somehow to keep talking, to let these things out from the dark corners where they'd festered for so long. We had a son, I said, my voice barely a whisper now, the words catching in my throat. Michael. We called him Mikey when he was little. A faint smile touched my lips, a ghost of a happier time. God, I remember when he was born, holding him for the first time, so damn small, so perfect, scared the hell out of me, the thought of being responsible for this tiny human being. I swore I'd be a better father than my own old man was to me. I really meant it, you know. I'd look at him sleeping in his crib, and I'd feel this fierce love, this urge to protect him from everything bad in the world. I wanted to give him everything I never had. But wanting and doing are two different highways, aren't they? I sighed, the smile long gone, replaced by a familiar ache. The road kept calling, or I kept answering, and Mikey, he grew up in snapshots. A Polaroid Susan would send to some truck stop up north, a hurried phone call on his birthday, where I'd promise him a bigger present next time, a present that could never make up for me not being there. School plays I missed, ball games I only heard about later, those father-son talks that never happened because I was 1,000 miles away, chasing another deadline, another paycheck that I told myself was for him, for them. But it was a lie. I see that now. It was for me, for my own inability to just be still, be present. I remember one time, he must have been about 10, I came home after a long haul, and he'd drawn this picture, a crayon drawing of our house, with him and Susan in the yard and my truck pulling away down the road. He didn't even draw me in it, just the truck. That picture, it said everything I didn't want to hear. He stopped asking when I'd be home for good after a while. Just that quiet acceptance from a kid that his old man was more a story than a real father. That drawing Mikey made, the one with my truck always leaving, it became the damn blueprint. For our lives, Maria, I said, my voice thick with a fresh wave of old grief. Susan tried, God knows she tried. She'd leave lights on for me, literally and figuratively, always hoping the man she married would pull up, not just the tired shell of a trucker, but the more miles I put on the rig, the more miles I put between us, even when I was sitting right beside her. The silences grew longer than any highway. Arguments would flare up over nothing, or over everything. The missed school conference, the anniversary dinner I called to cancel from 3 states away, the way I'd just stare blankly at the TV when I was home, too numb to connect. I remember one night, she just broke down, said she felt like a widow whose husband was still breathing, that she was raising Mikey alone, that the man she loved had vanished into his own loneliness and dragged her down with him. Her voice wasn't angry anymore. It was just broken, like fine china dropped one too many times. And what did I do? I clammed up. I didn't know how to fix it, how to be the man she needed, the father Mikey deserved. So I ran back to the only thing I thought I understood, the road. The actual split. It wasn't one big explosion, more like a slow, agonizing bleed-out. There were lawyers, papers signed that felt like they were written in my own blood, dividing up a life that had already been fractured beyond repair. She got the house, rightly so. It was the only stable thing Mikey had. And him, God. Michael, my breath hitched. After the divorce, the distance just became a chasm. Susan would try to get him on the phone when I called, but he was always busy or out with friends. I knew it was an excuse. I'd hear his voice in the background sometimes, that teenage mumble, and it was like a knife twisting. The visits became torture, awkward silences in some fast food joint, him staring out the window, me trying to find words that wouldn't come. He was angry, and he had every right to be. I was the stranger who shared his last name, the ghost who occasionally materialized with a guilty gift. The last time I saw him, he was maybe 16. He looked right through me, Maria, like I was made of glass. Said he didn't want anything from me, didn't need anything from me, that he and his mom were doing just fine. Then he walked away, just walked away. I haven't seen or heard from either of them since. That was, God, that was nearly a decade ago now. Sometimes I wonder if he even remembers what I look like. The silence in the cab after I spoke of Michael was heavier than any load I'd ever legally hauled. It was the silence of graves, of things lost forever. Maria didn't say a word, just continued her serene vigil, her presence a strange comfort in the storm of my recollections. It wasn't just them, you know, I finally managed, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It was like I had a talent for it. For pushing people away, for letting connections wither and die on. The vine, my folks. My mother used to worry herself sick every time I pulled out of their driveway. She had this small, hopeful look when I'd visit, like maybe this time I'd stay a bit longer, maybe this time I'd share something real from my life, but I was always guarded, always distant, already thinking about the next load, the next mile. I remember her phone calls, her voice getting a little frailer each year, asking if I was eating right, if I was safe. Simple things, but I was too busy, too self-absorbed to hear the love, the fear beneath it all. My dad, he was a man of few words, like I said. He tried to connect in his own way, asking about the truck, the roots. I saw it as him just making small talk. Now I realize he was trying to find common ground, a bridge to the sun who was always disappearing over the horizon. I missed his funeral because of a cross-country haul I told myself I couldn't get out of. The truth is, I was probably just scared to face the grief, to face what I'd lost, what I'd thrown away, and friends. That's almost a laughable word now, I continued, a bitter edge to my voice. Sure, There were guys I started out with, guys I shared beers and dreams with in greasy truck stop diners when we were all young and stupid and thought the world was ours for the taking. We swore we'd stay in touch, be there for each other. But the road has a way of eroding those bonds, like water on stone, especially if you don't make the effort. And I didn't. An 8. Unanswered call here, a missed birthday there, a sorry can't make it, stuck in a blizzard outside of nowhere too many times, and eventually your world shrinks down to the dimensions of your cab. People move on, live their lives, build families, and you become this anecdote. Whatever happened to old Jack, they might say. I built walls, Maria, not to keep others out, but to trap myself in, I think. Each broken promise, each missed connection, another brick, until all I had left for company were the ghosts of the people I used to know, and the deafening roar of my own regrets, amplified by the loneliness of 1,000 empty highways. There was no one left to call, even if I'd had the guts to pick up a phone. When I finally stopped talking, the only sound in the cab was my own ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of rain on the metal roof. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean, like every painful memory had been dragged out into the dim, murky light of that truck's interior. And laid bare, there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to pretend. I slumped against the steering wheel, the plastic cool against my forehead, a profound weariness settling into my bones, a fatigue that went deeper than any sleepless night on the road. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had carried too much, for too long, all by itself. I don't know how much time passed in that silence, me lost in the wreckage of my own making, Maria just present. Her stillness was a strange counterpoint to the turmoil I'd just unleashed. Then softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet, she spoke. "You've carried these burdens for a long time, Jack. The heart can only bear so much." She reached down, as she had in that other version of the night I sometimes still dream, into that simple cloth bag, and brought out the old thermos. "I have some tea. It's a calming blend. It might help settle your spirit, ease the storm inside." Normally, every alarm bell in my head would have been screaming. Lifetime on the road, the ingrained suspicion of strangers, the countless stories of drivers being tricked or worse. All of that should have made me refuse, should have made me wary. But I wasn't the same Jack who'd picked her up hours ago. That man, the cautious, cynical one, had been stripped away layer by layer with every confession. All that was left was this raw, aching core of regret and exhaustion. I looked at her, at the gentle offering in her eyes, and for reasons I still can't fully articulate, I trusted her. Or maybe I was just too tired to fight anymore, too desperate for a moment's peace, any kind of respite from the ghosts that clawed at me. "Yeah," I heard myself say, my voice barely a croak. "Yeah, tea sounds good." She poured it into the small cup, the steam rising with that same faint, sweet herbal scent I couldn't quite name. It smelled of forgotten gardens and quiet rooms. She handed it to me, her fingers cool against mine for a brief instant. I took a sip. It was warm, and it did feel soothing, a gentle wave spreading through my chest, quieting the frantic beat of my heart. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, a distant cousin of peace, perhaps. That brief flicker of peace I'd felt from the tea, it wasn't fleeting. It began to spread, a slow, warm tide rising through me, heavy and insistent. The dashboard lights, the green glow of the CB, the smeared landscape rushing past in the rainy night. It all started to soften, the edges blurring. My eyelids felt like they had lead weights attached to them. I remember trying to say something, maybe to thank her, or to ask what was in the tea that made the world feel so distant, so muffled, but the words wouldn't form. My thoughts were like molasses, slow and sticky. The rain on the windshield became a gentle, hypnotic drumming. I was vaguely aware of Maria still sitting beside me, a silent, still presence, her face turned towards me, serene as ever in the dim, shifting light of the cab. There was a strange sense of surrender, of finally letting go of a burden I hadn't even realized I could put down. The wheel in my hands felt impossibly heavy. I think I mumbled something about needing to pull over, but I don't recall if I did or if she said anything. The warmth just enveloped me, a dark, comforting blanket, and then nothing. Just a deep, bottomless black. I came to with a jolt, like I'd been kicked. A gasp tore from my throat and my head exploded with a pain so intense it made me cry out. For a few seconds, maybe minutes, I had no idea where I was, who I was. My mouth was parched, tasting of mud and something foul, and a freezing dampness had seeped deep into my bones. I wasn't in my cab. I was sprawled on cold, wet ground, sharp stones and twigs digging into my back and side. Above me, a pale, unforgiving grey sky was visible through a tangle of skeletal tree branches. Panic, raw and primal, surged through me, overriding the throbbing in my head. I pushed myself up, my limbs trembling, my clothes soaked and muddy. "Maria," I croaked, my voice a shredded whisper. I spun around, wild-eyed, heart hammering. Woods. Just dense, unfamiliar woods stretching out in every direction. No sign of a road, no distant hum of traffic, and dear God, no sign of my truck. The rig, my lifeblood, the only home I'd known for years, had vanished. It was gone, and with it, the serene woman in white. The crushing, horrifying reality began to dawn, colder and sharper than the morning air. My mind felt like it was full of broken glass, each thought sending splinters of pain through my skull. I stumbled through the undergrowth, shouting her name. "Maria! Maria!" A desperate, stupid sound swallowed by the indifferent trees. Of course, she wasn't there. Part of me already knew it. I patted myself down, a frantic, clumsy dance of despair. My pockets were all turned out, limp and empty. Wallet gone, cash gone. My commercial driver's license, my rig, registration, the logbook I'd painstakingly kept, all my goddamn papers, gone. My phone, my lifeline to the world. The only way to call for help or even know where the hell I was. Gone. They'd even taken the cheap watch from my wrist and the worn leather belt my father had given me years ago. Stripped. I was stripped of everything that connected me to the road, to my job, to my identity as Jack Miller, trucker. I sank to my knees in the mud, the cold seeping into my jeans, a laugh bubbling up. In my throat, a raw, hysterical sound that was half sob, half howl. How could I have been so blind, so utterly, pathetically stupid? That serene face, those understanding eyes. A con, a damn con artist. And then, like a physical blow, the thought of the cargo hit me. The thousands of dollars worth of electronics I was hauling, my responsibility, my bond, that too, gone. My stomach churned and I retched, bringing up nothing but bile and the bitter taste of betrayal. It wasn't just personal ruin. It was professional devastation. I was a driver without a truck, without a license, without a shred of credibility left. Who would ever trust me again? How could I even begin to explain this to my dispatcher, to the company? Yeah, I picked up some strange woman in white, poured my heart out to her, then drank some magic tea she gave me, and woke up in the woods. They'd laugh me out of the industry if they didn't press charges first. The humiliation was a burning brand on my soul. All those years of trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism, of pride in what I did, gone in one night of idiotic vulnerability. That woman, Maria, whatever her real name was, hadn't just robbed me of my truck and my possessions. She'd robbed me of the last vestiges of my self-respect, leaving me broken and alone in the wilderness with nothing but the crushing weight of my own foolishness. It felt like an eternity I wandered through that cold, damp wilderness, driven by a desperate, primal need to find help, to reach civilization. My head throbbed, my body ached, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. Finally, after what must have been hours of pushing through thorny bushes and stumbling over roots, I saw it, a glint of sun on distant asphalt. The highway. I practically crawled the last 100 yards, emerging onto the shoulder looking like something dragged out of a swamp, waving my arms like a madman at the first truck that came along. The driver, a young guy with wide, startled eyes, probably thought I was a psycho, but he stopped. I must have been a sight covered in mud, babbling my story. He gave me a bottle of water, a stale sandwich, and a ride to the nearest small town, to the local sheriff's office. Telling my story to the bored-looking deputy behind the counter was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I saw the flicker of disbelief, the pity, the unspoken judgment. Another fool trucker who got taken for a ride. But he took my statement, his pen scratching indifferently on the form. He confirmed it wasn't the first time. There were gangs operating in the region, using women as decoys, drugging drivers, and making off with valuable cargo. Standard operating procedure, he called it. My heart sank. I was just another statistic, another sucker. In the days and weeks that followed, as I tried to navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of replacing my documents and dealing with the trucking company's investigation, who, to their credit, were more understanding than I'd expected, likely because they'd seen this before, I started talking to other drivers. At truck stops, greasy spoon diners, loading docks. The story of what happened to me, Jack Miller, circulated. Many just shook their heads, offering a sympathetic, "Damn, man, that's rough." Some shared their own close calls or stories of guys they knew who'd fallen for similar traps. But then, something strange started to happen. When I described Maria, her calmness, the white dress, that unnervingly serene look in her eyes, the way she spoke, the things she seemed to know, a few of the older, more seasoned truckers would get this odd, quiet look. One told me about a driver who woke up unharmed, his truck and cargo untouched, but with a small, silver religious medal on his dashboard that hadn't been there before, and a feeling of profound peace. Another whispered about a woman in white who talked a suicidal driver down from a bridge, then vanished into the morning. Missed, and a few others had stories of encounters where this Maria figure had simply talked to them for hours, like she had with me, and then left. Nothing stolen, just a lingering sense of unease and a feeling they'd been seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. My case with the robbery seemed cruder, yet the descriptions of her were undeniably the same. It made no sense. The trucking company, to their credit, didn't press charges. Their insurance would cover the rig and cargo, eventually. But my driving career with them, any reputable company for that matter, was effectively over. My license was gone, my reputation, even if only in my own head, was shot. At 48 years old, with decades spent behind the wheel, I was suddenly grounded, adrift, with nothing to my name but a handful of borrowed clothes and a head full of conflicting images of Maria, the serene confidant, the calculating thief, the almost mythical figure from other drivers' whispered tales. Was she a devil? In white, a twisted kind of angel, or just a very skilled member of a ruthless gang? The questions gnawed at me, an unanswered riddle at the heart of my ruin. But questions wouldn't put food in my belly or a roof, however temporary, over my head. The raw necessity of survival began to overshadow even the humiliation and the confusion. I had to do something, anything, to crawl out of the pit I'd fallen into, a pit dug partly by her actions and partly by my own lifetime of emotional negligence that had made me so vulnerable in the first place. Swallowing my pride felt like swallowing broken glass. I, Jack Miller, who had once owned his own rig, who had considered himself a king of the highway, now found myself at the absolute bottom of the trucking world's food chain. I took a job as a lumper, a freight handler, at a sprawling warehouse complex on the outskirts of some anonymous city. My days became a blur of heaving boxes, stacking pallets, sweating under the merciless sun, or shivering in refrigerated trailers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who used to command 18 wheels was now a beast of burden, loading and unloading other men's trucks. My back screamed in protest. Muscles I didn't know I had ached constantly. And my hands, once skilled at navigating a big rig through tight spots, became raw and calloused from manual labor. Some of the younger drivers, full of the same piss and vinegar I once had, would look at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. This older, broken-down guy, struggling to keep up. Each night, I'd collapse onto a lumpy mattress in a cheap rooming house, too exhausted to even dream, the image of Maria's serene face a little dimmer, a little less immediate, but the weight of her impact, of what that one night had cost me, was a constant heavy presence. The days at the warehouse bled into weeks, then months, each one a testament to sheer, stubborn survival. The physical labor was brutal, leaving me too tired most nights to do much more than stare at the cracked ceiling of my rented room. But in those quiet hours, or during the mindless repetition of stacking boxes, my mind would inevitably drift back to that night, to Maria. The invisible scars she'd left throbbed more painfully than any strained muscle. I'd replay our conversation, her soft voice, her unnervingly accurate insights into the barren landscape of my life. Had it all been a meticulously crafted illusion designed to lull me into a state of vulnerable trust? Or was there something more to her, something that the other truckers' strange stories hinted at? Was she a phantom, a saint to some, a demon to others? The contradiction of it all was a constant torment. The woman who had seemed to understand my deepest regrets, my most profound failures, was also the one who had callously stripped me of everything I owned. It was a bitter pill to swallow, this mix of remembered intimacy and cold betrayal. The trauma of the robbery was a raw, open wound. But beneath it, the things I'd confessed to her, the truths about Susan, Michael, my own hollow existence, those were older, deeper infections she had lanced open. Losing my truck, my license, every cent to my name, it had felt like dying. And in a way it was. The Jack Miller who lived for the road, who defined himself by the rig he drove, that man was gone. He'd been forcibly retired, wiped off the map, and in the emptiness that followed, with nothing left to hide behind, no more highways to escape down, I was forced to confront the wreckage. The raw, unvarnished truth of my life, the one I'd spilled out to Maria in the dark intimacy of that cab, was all I had left. And slowly, painfully, like a man learning to walk again after a crippling accident, I began to understand something. All those material things that had been taken from me, as devastating as their loss was, they were also the things that had kept me from looking at myself, truly looking. They were the distractions, the excuses, the buffer between me and the aching void I'd created with my own choices long before Maria ever stepped into my life. The theft had been brutal, a violation, but what it had uncovered, what it had forced me to face, that was a reckoning that was long, long overdue. The more I turned that night over in my mind, during the endless hours of physical toil or the equally long hours of solitude in my cramped room, the less it felt like a straightforward crime and more like some kind of brutal, unasked-for crucible. That ride I gave Maria, thinking she was some damsel in distress, it had been a dark rite of passage. It had dragged me to the absolute limit of what I thought I could endure, forced me to confront the sum total of my failures, the emptiness I'd tried so hard to outrun. I'll likely never know what she truly was, a calculating thief with an uncanny ability to read people, a troubled soul playing a dangerous game, or something far stranger, something that brushed against the edges of the spiritual, as those old truckers' tales hinted. Maybe she was all of them. But whatever her true nature, her presence in my life for that one devastating night had acted like a wrecking ball to the prison I'd built around myself. She hadn't just taken my truck, she'd taken my carefully constructed defenses, my illusions, my ability to keep lying to myself. She'd shown me the barren man I had become, and then left me to pick through the rubble. It wasn't like a switch. Flipped and suddenly I was a new man, full of wisdom and light. Hell no. The days were still a grind, the nights often filled with a familiar loneliness, and the shame of what happened, of how easily I was broken, still clung to me like road dust. But something was shifting, almost imperceptibly at first. Working in that warehouse, shoulder to shoulder with other guys just trying to make it through the day, I started to see them, really see them. Before, they would have just been background, noise, obstacles in my path. Now I noticed the weariness in their eyes, the forced smiles, the small acts of camaraderie. I found myself listening more, a habit born from years of silence in the cab. But now it was a different kind of listening. Less about waiting for my turn to speak, more about just hearing. I still carried the marks of my fall, the raw memory of that night, the aching loss of my past life. But it was like the ground beneath my feet, while still rocky, was becoming a little more solid. The endless loop of my past mistakes, the ones I'd confessed to Maria, didn't play quite so loudly in my head. Or maybe I was just learning to live with the soundtrack of my own flawed humanity. I spent the better part of a year humping boxes at that warehouse, slowly rebuilding a sliver of a life, one paycheck, one exhausting day at a time. I'd managed to get a new ID, a new social security card, the basic scaffolding of a man who exists on paper. The memory of Maria, and that night, was no longer a raw, gaping wound, but a deep, complex scar, a permanent part of my landscape. Then, one sweltering afternoon, a man named Sal, an old-timer who owned a small, struggling freight company with a couple of ancient rigs, came looking for a short-term loader. He'd known me vaguely from my previous life, years back, before my fall from grace. He watched me work for a bit, saw the sweat, the grime, the way I just kept my head down and did the job without complaint. Later, he found me, on my break, drinking lukewarm water from a plastic bottle. He didn't mince words. One of his drivers had quit suddenly, and he was in a bind. He had an old, beat-up Mack, a real rust bucket that most young drivers wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, but it ran. He asked if I still had my CDL. I told him no, told him what happened, the whole sorry tale, expecting him to walk away. But Sal just grunted, chewed on his unlit cigar, and then, to my utter astonishment, said, if I could get myself licensed again, he might have some runs for me, short hauls, local stuff mostly. It wasn't a promise, just a sliver of a chance. It took months of navigating bureaucracy, saving every spare dime for fees, studying for the tests again like a rookie, swallowing my pride to ask for help with practice runs from a sympathetic local driving school instructor who'd heard whispers of my story. But eventually, I did it. I got my CDL back. True to his word, Sal gave me the keys to that old Mack. The first time I climbed into that cab, the cracked vinyl seat groaning under my weight, the smell of old diesel and years of other men's sweat filling my nostrils, it was a profoundly strange moment. It was like coming home to a place I barely recognized. The truck was a noisy, cantankerous beast, nothing like the smooth power I'd once been used to. But as I pulled out onto the highway, the familiar rumble vibrating through me, I wasn't the same man who had last driven a rig. The road ahead was no longer an escape route, no longer a place to lose myself. My gaze wasn't fixed on some distant, ever-receding horizon. I found myself noticing the small details, the way the light changed in the late afternoon, the expressions on the faces of other drivers at truck stops, the quiet dignity of the landscape. I drove slower, more deliberately, not out of fear, but out of a newfound respect for the journey itself and for the fragile human being behind the wheel. It's not like I woke up one day and all the pain was gone, all the regrets erased. That's stuff for movies, not for life. The scars from that night and from the decades before it, they're still there, etched deep into me. There are still moments, usually in the dead of night or when I'm alone on some long, empty stretch where the memory of Maria's serene face, the betrayal, the sheer desolation of waking up in those woods comes rushing back with a chill. But it's different now. I don't try to outrun it anymore. I just let it be, acknowledge it, another layer of the man I've become. Driving that old Mac, I found myself doing things the old Jack wouldn't have bothered with. I'd stop for a stranded motorist, even if it made me late. I'd take a few extra minutes at a diner to actually listen to the waitress when she seemed down, instead of just barking my order. I started noticing the world again, not just as a series of mile markers and fuel stops, but as a place full of other people, each carrying their own invisible loads. I began to pay attention to the quiet rhythm of my own breath, the taste of cheap coffee on a cold morning, the way the light painted the landscape at dawn. Small things, I know, but they were signs that something inside me, something I thought had died long ago, was slowly, tentatively coming back to life. As for Maria, she remains an enigma, a ghost in my past. I've long given up trying to figure out whether she was a con artist with a strangely spiritual touch, a fallen angel, or just a figment of a reality I couldn't comprehend at the time. Maybe it doesn't even matter what her intentions were or who she truly was. What matters is the devastating clarity that rose from the ashes of that encounter. She, or the experience she orchestrated, stripped me down to the studs, forced me to stare into the abyss of my own making. The wasted years, the broken relationships, the hollow man I had allowed myself to become. She took everything material, but in doing so, she, inadvertently or perhaps purposefully, who knows, showed me what was truly valuable, what couldn't be loaded onto a truck or bought with a paycheck. That night was a brutal, agonizing lesson, the kind you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. But it was a lesson in humanity, in my own lost humanity. And that, I've come to realize, is the heaviest, most precious cargo I'll ever carry. The stark, painful, beautiful burden of being truly awake to my own life again. Driving Sal's old Mac, feeling the road under me in a way I hadn't for years, not as an escape, but just as a place to be, a place to work. Something began to stir in me that went beyond just finding a quiet peace with myself. All those confessions I'd poured out to Maria in the dark of that cab, especially about Susan and Mikey, they weren't just memories anymore. They felt like unfinished business, a vast, gaping debt I owed. The more I felt myself slowly becoming a more present, more aware human being, the more unbearable. The thought of that silence, that decade-long chasm between me and my son, and the woman I'd so profoundly failed, became. Fear was a big part of it, a cold knot in my stomach at the thought of the rejection I probably deserved. But beneath the fear, there was this stubborn, fragile seed of hope, nurtured by the painful lessons of that transformative night. If Maria, whoever or whatever she was, had forced me to look at myself, then maybe, just maybe, I owed it to Susan and Mikey to show them that the man who'd hurt them wasn't entirely the man I was anymore. It took me months to gather the courage, months of wrestling with my pride and my terror. What could I possibly say? How could I even begin? Eventually, through an old acquaintance from Susan's side of the family I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, a call that was awkward and humbling in itself, I managed to get a current mailing address for her. Writing that first letter was like trying to pull my own teeth, page after page. I crumpled up, the words sounding hollow, self-serving, or just plain inadequate. How do you apologize for a decade of absence, for a broken home, for a childhood missed? In the end, I kept it short, just said I was different now, that I understood the pain I'd caused, and that if she was ever willing, I'd like a chance to tell her I was sorry, face to face. And about Michael, I just asked how he was, said I hoped he was happy, and that I'd understand if he wanted nothing to do with me. But the Door on my side would always be open if he ever felt like reaching out. No pressure, no expectations. I didn't expect a reply. I almost hoped I wouldn't get one, just to save myself the pain. But about 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived, her handwriting on the front. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open it. It wasn't a warm letter, not by any stretch. It was cautious, guarded, full of unspoken pain. But it wasn't a door slammed in my face either. She said she was surprised to hear from me. She said Michael was a young man now in college and that he'd had a tough time over the years because of my absence. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she didn't explicitly deny me the chance to try and earn a sliver of it either. She ended it by saying she needed time to think. Susan's letter, as guarded and non-committal as it was, felt like a single flickering candle in a vast darkness. Time to think, she'd written. And so, I gave her time. The days stretched into weeks, each one a tightrope walk between a desperate hope and a grim resignation. Every shift change at Sal's, every lonely evening in my small room, I'd brace myself for something or nothing. The old Jack would have been consumed by impatience, probably would have pushed too hard, called too soon, and blown any microscopic chance he had. He would have demanded or pleaded or retreated into bitter resentment. But the man who had survived that night with Maria, who had been stripped bare and forced to confront the ugliest parts of himself, had learned a harsh lesson in humility and the slow, agonizing grind of consequence. I had no right to expect anything, no right to demand forgiveness or understanding on my timeline. All I could do was keep putting one foot in front of the other, drive Sal's old truck, live as honestly as I could, and wait. The waiting itself became a kind of penance, a quiet space where I had to sit with my past and the uncertainty of any future that might involve my family. It was a harder road in some ways than any ice-covered mountain pass I'd ever driven. Then, one evening, after a particularly grueling day hauling scrap metal, my cheap pay-as-you-go phone buzzed with an unknown number. My heart did a familiar lurch. I almost didn't answer. The fear of it being a wrong number, or worse, a definitive rejection, was so strong. But I did. "Hello," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Jack?" It was her, Susan. Her voice, after all these years, live on the other end of a phone line. It was like a ghost walking into the room. It was thinner than I remembered, tinged with a weariness that spoke volumes. We talked for maybe 10 minutes that first time, and it was the most awkward, stilted conversation I'd ever had. We skirted around the past like it was a minefield, which of course it was. She asked about my job, if I was managing. I asked about her work. She mentioned Michael briefly, said he was deep into his studies, that he was a good kid. There was no warmth, no easy laughter like in the old days, just a careful, almost painful courtesy. But she didn't hang up. And as we were saying a strained goodbye, she said, almost as an afterthought, "Maybe we could talk again. Sometime. It wasn't a promise, wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't a no. And for a man who'd lived on nothing for so long, sometime felt like a fragile thread I could cling to with all my might. That first tentative phone call with Susan, the one that ended with a vague sometime, did eventually lead to another, and then another. They were infrequent at first, maybe once every few weeks, then gradually a bit more often. Each conversation felt like walking on eggshells. We never talked for long, and the shadows of the past were always there, lurking just beneath the surface of our careful words. Sometimes an old hurt would betray itself in a sudden sharpness in her tone, a fleeting reference to a time I'd let her down, and I learned to just absorb it, to acknowledge her pain without making excuses for myself, a skill the old defensive Jack never possessed. I told her about my quiet life, the runs in Sal's cantankerous old truck, the rhythm of hard work and simple meals. She, in turn, would share small, neutral details about her own life, her job, her garden. There was no talk of reconciliation, no hint of us ever being a couple again. That ship had sailed so long ago it was over the horizon and sunk. What was growing, if anything, was a fragile sort of truce, a hesitant acknowledgement that we were two people who had once shared a significant part of our lives, and who were now, cautiously, learning to speak a new, much quieter language. It was exhausting in its own way, more draining than any long haul, but it was a good kind of tired. Michael remained the silent, towering elephant in the room during those calls. Susan would mention him, of course, in passing. Michael's doing well in his classes, or he's thinking about a summer internship. I'd listen, my heart aching with a mixture of pride and a profound, sorrowful distance. I'd ask as gently as I could if he was happy, if he was okay, and her answers were always brief, carefully curated. I knew she was fiercely protective of him, and I couldn't fault her for it. I was the one who had abdicated my role, the one who had inflicted the wounds. I never pushed to speak to him, never asked her to pass on messages beyond my general hope that he was thriving. That was a bridge too far, a step I had no right to initiate. If Michael ever wanted to acknowledge my existence again, it had to be entirely on his terms, in his own time. All I could do was keep trying to be a better man, the kind of man who, if that day ever came, might be worthy of a second glance from the son I barely knew. The thought of him, a young man now, navigating the world without a father's guidance because of my failures, was a constant dull ache, a reminder of the steepest part of the climb still ahead, if there was even a path there at all. The calls with Susan continued, settling into a kind of fragile rhythm over many months. We were like two archaeologists excavating a ruin, carefully brushing away the debris of years, wary of triggering a collapse. We mostly talked about the present, safe, neutral topics. I'd tell her about some quirky old character I'd met on a run for Sal, or a near miss with a deer on a foggy morning, and she'd reciprocate with stories about her work colleagues or a new book she was reading. The old, easy intimacy was long gone, replaced by this careful dance of words. But then, one evening, she asked me about the Maria incident, not the details of the robbery, but about the conversation I'd had with her, the things I'd confessed. I'd mentioned it briefly in my first letter, that the encounter had, in a strange way, been a catalyst for me wanting to change, to reach out. I found myself telling her, hesitantly at first, then with more openness, about the way that strange woman had seen right through me, about the raw pain of confronting my failures as a husband, as a father. Susan listened for a long time, without saying anything. When I finished, there was a different kind of silence on the line, less guarded, more thoughtful. "You really have changed, haven't you, Jack?" she said, her voice quiet, a note of something I couldn't quite decipher in it. Surprise, maybe even a reluctant acknowledgement. It wasn't absolution, but it felt like a crack of light in a very dark room. Not long after that conversation, as Michael's 21st birthday approached, a date I'd marked on my mental calendar with a familiar pang of sorrow and regret each year, Susan brought him up more directly than she ever had before. "He's a good man, Jack," she said, and I could hear the undisguised pride in her voice, a pride I had no claim to share, but felt a distant echo of nonetheless. "He's worked hard, overcome a lot." Then, after a pause that stretched my nerves taut, she added, "He knows we've been talking. I told him you reached out." I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable, "and he wants nothing to do with you." But what she said was, "He didn't say much. You know Michael. He keeps his feelings close, but if you wanted to send him a card for his birthday, something small, you could send it to my address. I'll make sure he gets it." She rushed on, as if to temper any sudden hope. "No guarantees, Jack. No promises he'll respond or even read it, but I'll give it to him. A card. The possibility of that small piece of paper carrying my words, reaching my son's hands after a decade of silence. It was a terrifying prospect, almost as terrifying as never having the chance at all. My own hand was shaking as I hung up the phone, a maelstrom of fear and a fragile, scarcely believable hope churning inside me. Finding the right card, and then the right words to put in it, was one of the hardest, damn things I've ever done. What do you say to a son you only know as a ghost of memory, a son whose life you've been absent from for all his formative years? Happy birthday felt so trivial, so hollow. I must have bought a dozen cards, written and torn up twice as many drafts. In the end, I settled on something simple, a plain card with a landscape on the front. Inside, I didn't make excuses, didn't beg for forgiveness. I just told him I was thinking of him on his birthday, that I hoped he had a good day, and that I was proud of the young man I heard he'd become. I wrote that I knew I'd made a lot of mistakes I regretted deeply, and that I didn't expect anything from him, but that my door and my heart would always be open to him if he ever felt the slightest inclination. I signed it simply, "Your dad, Jack." Mailing it felt like launching a tiny paper boat into a vast, stormy ocean. Then came the waiting, an entirely new kind of agony. Weeks crawled by. Every unknown call made my heart leap. Every day without a word was a quiet internal confirmation of what I probably deserved: silence. I tried to keep my expectations at bay, tried to focus on my runs for Sal, on the small, tangible realities of my changed life. But the hope, that stubborn, fragile thing, it flickered. Months passed after I sent that card, and the silence from Michael's end was deafening, yet somehow I'd steeled myself for it. Susan and I continued our infrequent, careful calls. She never mentioned the card, and I never asked. It was an unspoken territory, too delicate to tread. I figured he'd either thrown it away, or read it and felt nothing, or worse, felt contempt. I had made my gesture, put my small, inadequate apology out into the world, and the rest wasn't up to me. Then, one Tuesday morning, as I was doing my pre-trip check on Sal's old Mac, my burner phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. "Thanks for card." No name, no punctuation, nothing else. My hand started shaking so hard, I almost dropped the phone. Thanks for card. It wasn't a conversation, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't an invitation, but it wasn't silence either. It was an acknowledgement, a tiny crack in the wall that had stood between us for over a decade. I stared at those 3 words until the letters blurred, a lump forming in my throat so big I could barely swallow. It was the smallest of gestures, but it felt as momentous as the shifting of continents. He hadn't shut me out completely. There was a microscopic sliver of something. Not hope, maybe, not yet, but a possibility. The possibility of a beginning. That text message, those 3 little words, they didn't magically fix anything. There were no tearful reunions, no sudden healing of old wounds. Life isn't a movie. The relationship with Susan remains one of carefully navigated history, a shared past that will always be part of us, but will never be our present again. And Michael, well, Michael is a young man finding his own way, carrying his own scars, some of which I put there. After that first text, there were a few more, months apart. Short, impersonal updates about his studies, a question about a type of engine once. Nothing deep, nothing emotional. But it's a connection, however tenuous. It's a path I never thought would even exist. I'm still out here driving for Sal, the old Mac groaning its way down the highways. I still think about Maria sometimes, that strange, serene catalyst for so much destruction and, paradoxically, so much creation within me. I'll never understand that night fully, the mystery of her, the way she seemed to know the precise fault lines of my soul. But I understand what came after. The pain, the loss, it all stripped me down to nothing. And in that nothingness I had to choose, stay broken or try to build something new from the shards. What Maria stole was just stuff. What she unknowingly, or knowingly, God only knows, forced me to confront was myself. And that confrontation, as brutal as it was, set me on this long, hard road back to something resembling a life. A life where I can look myself in the mirror without flinching, where I can try, however imperfectly, to mend the fences I tore down. The biggest load I carry these days isn't freight. It's the weight of my past, yes, but it's also the tentative, precious weight of possibility. The possibility of connection, of quiet dignity, of being a father, even a distant one, to my son. It's the weight of being human with all its flaws and its flickers of grace. And for a man who once felt like a ghost haunting his own existence, that weight, that load, is a privilege to bear. It's a long haul, this journey, and I'm a long way from any final destination. But for the first time in what feels like a lifetime, I'm not just running empty anymore. I'm carrying something real,